March 8, 1944, 20,000 feet above occupied France. Captain James Tex Morrison had been alone for 3 hours. Not alone in the way men were alone back home, but alone in the way a pilot was alone when the radio went dead, the sky emptied, and the only thing behind him was a German Messerschmitt BF 109 that refused to fire. The Luftwaffe pilot was patient, skilled, dangerous. Tex could feel him there without seeing him, tucked perfectly into the Thunderbolt's blind spot, waiting for the American to make one mistake. A single sloppy turn, a moment of fatigue, a desperate move. They always waited when they thought they had a Thunderbolt cornered. The P-47D wasn't supposed to be this deep in enemy airspace. 7 tons of aluminum and steel wrapped around a 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney radial engine. The bomber crews called it the Jug because it looked like a flying milk bottle. German pilots had laughed when they first encountered it. Too heavy, too slow to climb, turned like a freight train. They stopped laughing when the Thunderbolt dove. Tex had been escorting B-17s toward Stuttgart when 3 German fighters dropped on him out of the sun. He damaged one with a long deflection burst and watched it trail smoke toward home. The other 2 stayed disciplined, taking turns, forcing him lower, bleeding his options away. Now there was only one left. The German pilot slid left, subtly herding Tex toward a turn that would put the Thunderbolt squarely in the 109's gun sight. The fuel gauge crept downward. The engine temperature needle edged toward red. 3 hours at combat power was cooking the Pratt and Whitney from the inside out. The German knew it. That was why he waited. Tex thought about Sarah back in Austin. 6 months pregnant. The letter had arrived 2 weeks earlier, folded so many times it was soft as cloth. A photo tucked inside. Sarah on their porch, hand resting on her belly, smiling that church dance smile that had hooked him 4 years earlier. He could feel the picture against his chest under the parachute. Tex had maybe 10 seconds to decide how he was going to die. If he turned into the German, the Messerschmitt would rake him with 20mm cannon fire. If he kept flying straight, the Thunderbolt's engine would overheat and seize, and the German would finish him at leisure. The fuel gauge was sinking faster now. The oil pressure needle trembled. There was one other option. The instructor back in Texas had called it crazy as a rattlesnake in a sleeping bag. That instructor had never been alone over Germany with a dying engine and a predator on his tail. Tex pulled the stick back hard. The Thunderbolt surged upward in a brutal zoom climb, pinning him into the seat with 4GS. The engine screamed in protest. The airframe shuddered. Every instinct said he was committing suicide. No P-47 tried to outclimb a BF 109. The German pilot must have thought exactly that. At 18,000 feet, with the Jug hanging on its propeller and seconds from a stall, Tex kicked full rudder and let the aircraft fall into a spin. To the German, it looked perfect. The American had finally overplayed his hand. A heavy fighter, stalled and spiraling, an easy kill. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove, lining up for the shot. Tex was counting. 1 rotation. 2. 3. At 15,000 feet, he snapped opposite rudder, stopped the spin, rolled inverted, and shoved the nose straight down. The Thunderbolt became a falling anvil. Weight, its supposed weakness, became its weapon. The Jug accelerated faster than anything else in the European sky. The Messerschmitt was already committed to his dive and couldn't pull out without flying straight into Tex's guns. They were closing at over 600 miles an hour. At 800 yards, Tex fired. 8 .50 caliber machine guns erupted, throwing 100 rounds per second forward. M8 incendiary ammunition burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The tracers looked like solid beams of light stitching the air. At 600 yards, rounds smashed into the Messerschmitt's cowling. Aluminum peeled back. At 400, smoke poured out. At 200, the German fighter detonated. The explosion swallowed the sky. Tex flew through it at 400 miles an hour, debris hammering the canopy, oil splashing across the glass until everything turned brown. The cockpit filled with the smell of burning fuel and metal. For a few terrifying seconds, he was flying blind, diving toward the ground with no horizon. He eased back on the stick, blackness closing in at the edges of his vision. The altimeter unwound. 10,000. 8. 6. He leveled out at 4,000 feet, hands shaking so badly he could barely read the gauges. The engine was dying. Temperature pegged red. Oil pressure near zero. The propeller vibrated like it wanted to tear itself free. Black smoke streamed from the cowling. But Tex was alive. The German wasn't. Below him lay the French countryside. Fields and villages that looked peaceful from the air, but were crawling with German troops. The engine coughed once, twice, then seized with a grinding scream that cut through the wind noise. Silence. 7 tons of fighter became 7 tons of glider. The Thunderbolt had the glide ratio of a brick. From 4,000 feet, Tex had maybe 5 miles. He picked a field near a stand of trees, gear up to avoid flipping, flaps down to slow the approach. The drainage ditch appeared at the last second. Impact drove the breath out of him. The jug bounced, hit again, skidded across mud. A wing dug in. The aircraft spun, tore itself apart, and finally stopped. Tex hung upside down in his harness, blood dripping into his eyes, copper on his tongue. Training took over. Release. Get out. Get away. His shoulder was dislocated. Ribs broken. Every breath felt like drowning in air. He grabbed the escape kit. Maps, compass, francs, morphine, benzodrine, a .38 revolver with 12 rounds. The odds for a downed pilot were 1 in 10. Tex didn't think about odds. He staggered into the trees as the Thunderbolt burned behind him, smoke rising like a beacon. German patrols would already be moving. The forest was thick and unforgiving. He pushed west, using the compass whenever the sun broke through. 3 miles in, the adrenaline faded and pain took over. He forced his shoulder back into place, biting down on a stick to keep from screaming. That night he crawled into a barn loft and buried himself in hay. Voices came later. German voices. Bayonets stabbed into the hay, inches from his face. Tex held his breath, finger on the trigger. The blade slid between his arm and ribs, cold as death. Then laughter. Footsteps moved away. He waited an hour before moving. By the 3rd day, fever set in. Infection or exhaustion, he didn't know. The world blurred. He talked to Sarah out loud, planned baby names, argued with ghosts. He collapsed into a shallow cave at dusk. When he woke, a boy stood at the entrance. 12 maybe, watching him silently. The boy spoke first, halting English. American. Bosch look for you. Tex's hand drifted toward the revolver, then stopped. The boy studied him, made a decision. You wait, he said. I bring help. Tex closed his eyes, not knowing whether he'd just been saved or betrayed. The boy returned just before dusk, moving out of the trees as quietly as a deer. He couldn't have been more than 12 or 13. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at Tex as if memorizing his face, deciding whether this wounded stranger was worth the risk. Then he nodded once and disappeared again. 2 hours later, the forest whispered with movement. 3 men emerged from the shadows. Farmers, by their clothes and hands. Thick fingers, cracked skin, shoulders bent from years of labor. Their eyes were sharp. These were men who had already decided how much danger they were willing to accept and how much they were not. They spoke in low, urgent French. The boy translated in fragments. You cannot stay here. Too many Germans. They search every farm. Tex tried to stand and failed. One of the men caught him before he hit the ground. More discussion. A pause. Then a decision. We help, the boy said. But if Germans come, we leave you. Tex nodded. He understood. There were limits to courage, and none of these men owed him their lives. They carried him only at night. By day they hid in woods, barns, drainage ditches, anywhere German patrols wouldn't linger. Trucks passed close enough for Tex to hear engines idling and soldiers laughing. Once, boots crunched on gravel less than 20 yards away. Tex lay still, revolver in his hand, breath shallow, ready to die quietly if it came to that. Fever came in waves. Sometimes he was back in the Thunderbolt, the engine screaming, the altimeter spinning. Sometimes he was home in Austin, standing on the porch with Sarah, her hand on her belly, the world still whole. Sometimes everything blurred together into heat, pain, and noise. The woman was named Marie. That probably wasn't her real name. Tex never asked. She ran a safe house with the calm efficiency of someone who had already lost everything fear could take from her. She cleaned his wounds with alcohol that burned like fire, reset ribs with hands that never shook, and hid him behind a false wall when German soldiers searched the house. When they tapped on the walls, Marie complained loudly, in perfect German, about her husband snoring and how thick the walls were the only thing that let her sleep. The soldiers laughed and left. Later, when the house was quiet again, she told Tex the truth. "My husband hit a British pilot," she said. "The Germans shot him in the street." She didn't cry. She'd already used up whatever tears she had. Tex stayed a week. Then another move. A monastery cellar. A wine cave. A barn loft that smelled of hay and animals. Other airmen passed through. Faces hollow, eyes too old for their age. Some were moved on. One died from infection and was buried under a name that wasn't his. Tex learned not to ask what happened to the people who helped him after he left. On the final night, a boy, 16 at most, guided him through a minefield toward the coast. The boy knew the safe paths because his grandfather had watched the Germans lay the mines, memorized every pattern. At the water's edge, the boy stopped. A signal light blinked far out in the darkness. The channel was black and endless. The boy shook Tex's hand once, hard, like a man twice his age. "Bon chance," he whispered. Tex swam. The cold hit like a hammer. Muscles locked. Breath vanished. He forced himself forward, stroke by stroke, fighting the urge to scream, to turn back, to give up. A patrol boat passed close enough for him to hear voices. He went under, lungs burning, counting seconds like prayers. Hands grabbed him and hauled him aboard. British voices. Blankets. Brandy that felt like fire and life at the same time. England appeared at dawn, gray and solid and impossibly beautiful. Tex returned to his squadron officially dead, then very much alive. He flew again until the war finally ran out of pilots, planes, and boys to feed it. He went home. He held his son. He kept his promise. But the war never really ended. Decades later, when people asked him about the Thunderbolt, Tex didn't talk about kills or medals or heroics. He talked about a boy in a cave, a woman who lied to save a stranger, farmers who carried him knowing they might die for it, men who never made it home. And he would say, quietly, with hands that still trembled, surviving the war wasn't the victory. Living long enough to remember it was.